We are in the African Meeting House, built in 1806 by and for Boston's African American community, and now a part of the Museum of African American History. It served as a church, a school, a gathering place, and a cultural center. For nearly 100 years, this was a place where ideas were exchanged and African American culture was nurtured. Even in the 1800s, African Americans challenged the appropriation and misrepresentation of their culture.
One of the ways they did this was by writing their own history. William Cooper Nell's The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution from 1855 was one of the first books of African American history and inspired others to be the curators of their own culture. William Wells Brown, Edward A. Johnson, and Carter G. Woodson each wrote about Black leaders, innovators, and courageous soldiers from the 1816 through 1920s to inspire new zeal and fresh courage among African American children and adults. Each was fighting a stigma that mainstream America created about its Black citizens, the most grotesque example being the nation's first hit film, The Birth of a Nation, which debuted in 1915. Black communities were so outraged by the film's misrepresentation of their history that it spurred thousands in Boston to protest the film, culminating with a rally on the state capitol steps. These acts of appropriation are not new in American society, and long before Birth of a Nation, the minstrel show was a hotbed of cultural appropriation.
One of the earliest forms of cultural appropriation in America were minstrel shows. A minstrel show features white performers in blackface, and while dressing as another race for theater has been around for centuries, the undertaking of performing in the costume of another race with the intention of mockery began with the performer Thomas Dartmouth Rice. In the 1820s, Rice's staple character, Jim Crow, was a tricky, lazy, dancing enslaved man whose name later became the name for the racially segregationist laws enforced in the South. Minstrel shows were widely popular in the 1800s, and another element of minstrel shows, mockery of Black culture, was the way in which they depicted African American speech and language, which is an important marker of culture.
African American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote in the 1890s and negotiated that powerful language. The only way for Paul Laurence Dunbar to make a living as a writer and a poet was to wear this mask of Negro dialect when he wrote. The literary audience was white and demanded exploitation of Black lifestyle. Although it may seem that Dunbar was tiptoeing around the racial hostility towards the Black race in his dialect poems, if one examines his work closely, that resistance is there. The reclaiming and uplift is there. Dunbar took this dialect back not to exploit or mark, but to uplift his race.
The Harlem Renaissance was a blossoming of African American culture, particularly in the creative arts in the 1920s and 1930s.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.
During this time, Black musicians, artists, and writers like Metta Warrick Fuller, Langston Hughes, and Pauline Hopkins, Wallace Thurman, and Zora Neale Hurston emerged. Through this, whites went to Harlem and brought Jim Crow with them. Langston Hughes said, "White people began to come to Harlem in droves. For several years, they packed the expensive Cotton Club on Lenox Avenue. Nor did ordinary Negroes like the growing influx of whites toward Harlem after sundown. Flooding the little cabarets and bars where formerly only colored people laughed and sang, and where now the strangers were given the best ringside tables to sit and stare at the Negro customers like amusing animals in a zoo."
African Americans developed their music from slavery to self-empowerment. This topic relates to cultural appropriation as white performers claim jazz as their own, rather than crediting Black people who created it. Jazz music emerged in New Orleans at a time when Jim Crow laws segregated both Blacks and Creoles into a group. But when jazz gained popularity in 1917, it was known as neither Black nor Creole. One of the first popular jazz bands was called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band, a group of 5 white musicians. Meanwhile, Black musicians such as Louis Armstrong continued to develop jazz music as well.
Oh, Maybelline, can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, you say what can make me feel. I will survive, oh, as long as I know how to love.
Hip-hop originated when young people created a new style of music from familiar rhythms and paired it with lyrics that expressed their lives. For example, Tupac used hip-hop to express his thoughts on oppression, racism, and poverty. When talking about culture appropriation, we will look at two artists, Iggy Azalea and Eminem, and their roles in the industry. In one of Iggy Azalea's latest music videos, she sang about being a runaway slave master while holding a whip. As an artist who recognizes herself as a part of hip-hop, Iggy should be more respectful and knowledgeable of the history and power behind it. Eminem appreciates the culture and respects it because he introduced himself to it in order to deal with his oppression. In an endearing letter to Tupac's mother, we see how much hip-hop means to him. He wrote, "You have no idea how much your son and his music has inspired me." It's important to compare them because this shows that not all white rappers are appropriating the culture. Hip-hop is a powerful form of expression, and when it's adapted without knowledge, it diminishes the art and can alienate people.
At its root, cultural appropriation is about lack of knowledge.
Cultural appropriation isn't necessarily racism.
If an understanding and respect is lacking, it becomes appropriation, a form of oppression.
Culture exchange is about gaining knowledge of a culture and sharing it respectfully.